On this day in 1957, with several compromises, including masking the real names of all the friends in his chronicles, Jack Kerouac finally got his book, On the Road, published. On the Road novelizes Jack Kerouac's years traveling the North American continent in the 1940s with his friend Neal Cassady, a sideburned hero of the snowy West. Neal was his friend and his muse. In fact, Neal Cassady was the muse of everyone who was considered part of that original Beat generation group. Well, maybe not everyone. I'm not sure. William Burroughs considered him a muse, but Ginsberg certainly did. And probably Corso and others who followed. As Sal Paradise and Dean Moriarty, who represented Jack Kerouac and Neal Cassady, respectively, the two roamed the country in a missionary quest for self-knowledge and experience, looking for the face of God. Kerouac's love of America, the real America, the people who lived, fought, sweat, toiled, not the America that was conceived by policies that of politic and Madison Avenue, but the people who he wanted to meet individually, not as a group, not as a metaphor, not as a representation of ideals, but as individuals with needs and wants, fears, loves. Well, that, combined with his compassion for humanity in general and his need to communicate in a new language of spontaneous prosody that mimicked the bebop jazz he so loved, all combined to make On the Road a work that spawned a new and lasting exploration into writing. Kerouac's classic novel of freedom and longing defined what it meant to be beat and has ignited every generation across every kind of medium since its initial publication almost 70 years ago. Unfortunately, much of what he represented and wrote was co-opted by Hollywood, by Madison Avenue, was misunderstood by the many who thought of him as Dean Moriarty when in fact he was the quiet and reflective and observant Sal Paradise. And so it wounded Kerouac deeply. He wasn't taken seriously as a writer, but as an object of curiosity. He didn't want to be necessarily a spokesperson for a generation, although essentially that's what he was. And he resented the role that he was placed in and how much his whole paradigm and his whole concept of search and for something more, something that was sort of between Buddhism and Catholicism, something that sort of had a little agnosticism in it. He wasn't dogmatic, and he didn't believe in dogma, and he didn't believe in the nuclear family that had spawned since the World War II. He just believed in people, again, as individuals living their lives as they wanted to, not as they were expected to. He wanted to find a different way, and he did hope to inspire people to do that. There's one quote that I will quote of his before I begin the excerpt that I want to read from the published On the Road. Quote, but yet, woe, 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 unto those who think that the beat generation means crime, delinquency, immorality, amorality. Woe unto those who attack it on the grounds that they simply don't understand history and the yearning of human souls. Woe, in fact, unto those who make evil movies about the beat generation, where innocent housewives are raped by beatniks. Woe unto those who spit on the beat generation. The wind will blow it back. End quote. So, although my favorite version of On the Road is the original scroll with all its original names of the characters and its unrelenting, unexpurgated flow, which was rejected and was reworked many, many times before it was finally published in 1957. I think maybe it was in the late 90s or maybe early 2000s when the original scroll was actually finally published as he had written it. It had been transcribed from that one long, endless scroll into a published book with binding that you could read. And it is great. If you've not read it, if you've only read the 1957 edition or subsequent editions of that particular version, I really encourage you to go out and seek the original scroll. It is, Amazon has it for nominal prices. You can get it used. Used is better, I think, anyway. And it is just absolutely wonderful. It even feels good in your hands the way the publishers published it. And so it is his truest, most poetic self on paper, and far, far exceeds what was achieved with that edited version. Okay, so anyway, I've babbled enough. I will start with chapter 1 of On the Road. I first met Dean not long after my wife and I split up. I'd just gotten over a serious illness that I won't bother to talk about, except that it had something to do with the miserably weary split up and my feeling that everything was dead. With the coming of Dean Moriarty began the part of my life you could call my life on the road. Before that, I'd often dreamed of going west to see the country, always vaguely planning and never taking off. Dean is the perfect guy for the road, because he actually was born on the road when his parents were passing through Salt Lake City in 1926 in a jalopy on their way to Los Angeles. First reports of him came to me through Chad King, who'd shown me a few letters from him written in a New Mexico reform school. I was tremendously interested in the letters because they so naively and sweetly asked Chad to teach him all about Nietzsche and all the wonderful intellectual things that Chad knew. At one point, Carlo and I talked about the letters and wondered if we would ever meet the strange Dean Moriarty. This is all far back, when Dean was not the way he is today, when he was a young jail kid shrouded in mystery. Then news came that Dean was out of reform school and was coming to New York for the first time. Also, there was talk that he had just married a girl called Mary Lou. One day, I was hanging around the campus, and Chad and Tim Gray told me Dean was staying in a cold water pad in East Harlem, the Spanish Harlem. Dean had arrived the night before, the first time in New York, with his beautiful little sharp chick, Mary Lou. They got off the Greyhound bus at 50th Street and cut around the corner looking for a place to eat, and went right in Hector's. And since then, Hector's cafeteria has always been a big symbol of New York for Dean. They spent money on beautiful big glazed cakes and cream puffs. All this time, Dean was telling Mary Lou things like, "Now, darling, here we are in New York, and although I haven't quite told you everything that I was thinking about when we crossed Missouri, and especially at the point when we passed the Boonville Reformatory, which reminded me of my jail problem, it is absolutely necessary now to postpone all those leftover things concerning our personal love things and at once begin thinking of specific work-life plans," and so on. In the way that he had in those early days. I went to the Coldwater flat with the boys, and Dean came to the door in his shorts. Mary Lou was jumping off the couch. Dean had dispatched the occupant of the apartment to the kitchen, probably to make coffee, while he proceeded with his love problems. For to him, sex was the one and only holy and important thing in life, although he had to sweat and curse to make a living and so on. You saw that in the way he stood, bobbing his head, always looking down, nodding like a young boxer to instructions, to make you think he was listening to every word, throwing in 1,000 yeses and that's rights. My first impression of Dean was of a young Gene Autry, trim, thin-hipped, blue-eyed, with a real Oklahoma accent, a side-burned hero of the snowy West. In fact, he'd just been working on a ranch at Walls in Colorado before marrying Mary Lou and coming east. Mary Lou was a pretty blonde with immense ringlets of hair like a sea of golden tresses. She sat there on the edge of the couch with her hands hanging in her lap and her smoky blue country eyes fixed in a wide stare because she was in an evil gray New York pad that she'd heard about back west and waiting like a long-bodied, emaciated Modigliani surrealist woman in a serious room. But outside of being a sweet little girl, she was awfully dumb and capable of doing horrible things. That night, we all drank beer and pulled wrists and talked till dawn. And in the morning, while we sat around dumbly smoking butts from ashtrays in the gray light of a gloomy day, Dean got up nervously, paced around, thinking, and decided the thing to do was to have Mary Lou make breakfast and sweep the floor. In other words, we've got to get on the ball, darling, what I'm saying. Otherwise, it'll be fluctuating and lack of true knowledge or crystallization of our plans. Then I went away. During the following week, he confided in Chad King that he absolutely had to learn how to write from him. Chad said I was a writer, and he should come to me for advice. Meanwhile, Dean had gotten a job in a parking lot, had a fight with Mary Lou in their Hoboken apartment, God knows why they went there, and she was so mad and so down deep vindictive that she reported to the police some false, trumped-up, hysterical, crazy charge. And Dean had to lamb from Hoboken. So he had no place to live. He came right out to Paterson, New Jersey, where I was living with my aunt. And one night, while I was studying, there was a knock on the door. And there was Dean, bowing, shuffling obsequiously in the dark of the hall and saying, "Hello, you remember me? Dean Moriarty. I've come to ask you to show me how to write." "And where's Mary Lou?" I asked. And Dean said she'd apparently hoard a few dollars together and gone back to Denver. The whore. So we went out to have a few beers because we couldn't talk like we wanted to talk in front of my aunt, who sat in the living room reading her paper. She took one look at Dean and decided that he was a madman. In the bar, I told Dean, "Hell, man, I know very well you didn't come to me, only to want to become a writer. And after all, what do I really know about it, except you've got to stick to it with the energy of a Benny addict?" And he said, "Yes, of course. I know exactly what you mean. And in fact, all those problems have occurred to me. But the thing that I want is the realization of those factors that should one depend on Schopenhauer's dichotomy for any inwardly realized." And so on. In that way, things I understood not a bit, and he himself didn't. In those days, he really didn't know what he was talking about. That is to say, he was a young jail kid all hung up on the wonderful possibilities of becoming a real intellectual, and he liked to talk in the tone and using the words, but in a jumbled way that he had heard from real intellectuals, although, mind you, he wasn't so naive as that in all other things. And it took him just a few months with Karl Marx to become completely in there with all the terms and jargon. Nonetheless, we understood each other on other levels of madness, and I agreed that he could stay at my house till he found a job, and furthermore, we agreed to go out west sometime. That was the winter of 1947. One night, when Dean ate supper at my house, he already had the parking lot job in New York. He leaned over my shoulder as I typed rapidly away and said, "Come on, man, those girls won't wait. Make it fast." I said, "Hold on just a minute. I'll be right with you as soon as I finish this chapter." And it was one of the best chapters in the book. Then I dressed, and off we flew to New York to meet some girls. As we rode in the bus in the weird phosphorescent void of the Lincoln Tunnel, We leaned on each other with fingers waving and yelled and talked excitedly, and I was beginning to get the bug like Dean. He was simply a youth tremendously excited with life, and though he was a con man, he was only conning because he wanted so much to live and to get involved with people who would otherwise pay no attention to him. He was conning me, and I knew it, for room and board and how to write, etc. And he knew I knew. This has been the basis of our relationship. But I didn't care, and we got along fine. No pestering, no catering. We tiptoed around each other like heartbreaking new friends. I began to learn from him as much as he probably learned from me. As far as my work was concerned, he said, "Go ahead, everything you do is great." He watched over my shoulder as I wrote stories, yelling, "Yes, that's right, wow, man," and "Phew," and wiped his face with his handkerchief. "Man, wow, there's so many things to do, so many things to write. How do you even begin to get it all down? And without modified restraints and all hung up like literary inhibitions and grammatical fears." "That's right, man. Now you're talking." And a kind of holy lightning I saw flashing from his excitement and his visions, which he described so torrentially that people in buses looked around to see the overexcited nut. In the West, he'd spent a third of his time in the pool hall, a third in jail, and a third in the public library. They'd seen him rushing eagerly down the winter streets, bareheaded, carrying books to the pool hall, or climbing trees to get into the attics of buddies, where he spent days reading or hiding from the law. We went to New York. I forget what the situation was. 2 colored girls. There were no girls there. They were supposed to meet him in a diner and didn't show up. We went to his parking lot where he had a few things to do, change his clothes in the shack and back and spruce up a bit in front of a cracked mirror and so on. And then we took off. And that was the night Dean met Carlo Marx. A tremendous thing happened when Dean met Carlo Marx. 2 keen minds that they are, they took to each other at the drop of a hat. 2 piercing eyes glanced into 2 piercing eyes. The holy con man with the shining mind, and the sorrowful poetic con man with the dark mind that is Carlo Marx. From that moment on, I saw very little of Dean, and I was a little sorry too. Their energies met head on. I was a lout compared. I couldn't keep up with them. The whole mad swirl of everything that was to come began then. It would mix up all my friends and all I had left of my family in a big dust cloud over the American night. Carlo told him of Old Bull Lee, Elmer Hassel, Jane Lee, in Texas growing weed, Hassel on Rikers Island, Jane wandering on Times Square in a benzodrine hallucination with her baby girl in her arms and ending up in Bellevue. And Dean told Carlo of unknown people in the West like Tommy Snark, the club-footed pool hall rotation shark and card player and queer saint. He told them of Roy Johnson, Big Ed Dunkel, his boyhood buddies, his street buddies, his innumerable girls and sex parties and pornographic pictures, his heroes, heroines, adventures. They rushed down the street together, digging everything in the early way they had, which later became so much sadder and perceptive and blank. But then they danced down the streets like dingle-doties, and I shambled after, as I've been doing all my life, after people who interest me. Because the only people for me are the mad ones. The ones who are mad to live, mad to talk, mad to be saved, desirous of everything at the same time. The ones who never yawn or say a commonplace thing, but burn, burn, burn like fabulous yellow Roman candles exploding like spiders across the stars. And in the middle, you see this blue center light pop, and everybody goes, ah. What did they call such young people in Goethe's Germany, wanting dearly to learn how to write like Carlo? The first thing you know, Dean was attacking him with a great, amorous soul such as only a con man can have. "Now, Carlo, let me speak. Here's what I'm saying." I didn't see them for about 2 weeks, during which time they cemented their relationship to fiendish all-day, all-night talk proportions. Then came spring, the great time of traveling, and everybody in the scattered gang was getting ready to take one trip or another. I was busily at work on my novel, and when I came to the halfway mark, after a trip down south with my aunt to visit my brother Rocco, I got ready to travel west for the very first time. Dean had already left. Carla and I saw him off at the 34th Street Greyhound Station. Upstairs they had a place where you could make pictures for a quarter. Carlo took off his glasses and looked sinister. Dean made a profile shot and looked coyly around. I took a straight picture that made me look like a 30-year-old Italian who'd kill anybody who said anything about his mother. This picture Carlo and Dean neatly cut down the middle with a razor and saved a half each in their wallets. Dean was wearing a real Western business suit for his big trip back to Denver. He'd finished his first fling in New York. I say fling, but he only worked like a dog in parking lots. The most fantastic parking lot attendant in the world. He can back a car 40 miles an hour into a tight squeeze and stop at the wall, jump out, race among fenders, leap into another car, circle it 50 miles an hour in a narrow space, back swiftly into a tight spot, hump, snap the car with the emergency so that you see it bounce as he flies out. Then clear to the ticket shack, sprinting like a track star, hand a ticket, leap into the newly arrived car before the owner's half out, leap literally under him as he steps out, start the car with the door flapping and roar off to the next available spot, arc, pop in, break, out, run, working like that without pause 8 hours a night. Evening rush hours and after theater rush hours and greasy wino pants with a frayed fur-lined jacket and beat shoes that flap. Now he bought a new suit to go back in. Blue, with pencil stripes, vest and all, $11 on 3rd Avenue, with a watch and watch chain, and a portable typewriter with which he was going to start writing in a Denver rooming house as soon as he got a job there. We had a farewell meal of Franks and beans in a 7th Avenue Rikers, and then Dean got on the bus that said Chicago and roared off into the night. There went our Wrangler. I promised myself to go the same way when spring really bloomed and opened up the land. And this was really the way that my whole road experience began. And the things that were to come are too fantastic not to tell. Yes, and it wasn't only because I was a writer and needed new experiences that I wanted to know Dean more, and because my life hanging around the campus had reached the completion of its cycle and was stultified, but because somehow, in spite of our difference in character, he reminded me of some long-lost brother. The sight of his suffering, bony face with the long sideburns and his straining, muscular, sweating neck made me remember my boyhood in those dye dumps and swim holes and riversides of Patterson and the Passaic. His dirty work clothes clung to him so gracefully as though you couldn't buy a better fit from a custom tailor, but only earn it from the natural tailor of natural joy, as Dean had, in his stresses. And in his excited way of speaking, I heard again the voices of old companions and brothers under the bridge, among the motorcycles, along the wash-lined neighborhood and drowsy doorsteps of afternoon where boys played guitars while their older brothers worked in the mills. All my other current friends were intellectuals, Chad, the Nietzschean anthropologist, Carlo and his nutty surrealist low-voiced serious staring talk, Old Bull Lee and his critical anti-everything drawl, or else they were slinking criminals like Elmer Hassel with that hip sneer. Jane Lee the same, sprawled on the oriental cover of her couch, sniffing at the New Yorker. But Dean's intelligence was every bit as formal and shining and complete, without the tedious intellectualness. And his criminality was not something that sulked and sneered. It was a wild, yeah-saying overburst of American joy. It was Western, the west wind, an ode from the plain, something new, long prophesied, long a-coming. He only stole cars for joyrides. Besides, all my New York friends were in the negative nightmare position of putting down society and giving their tired, bookish, or political or psychoanalytical reasons, but Dean just raced in society, eager for bread and love. He didn't care one way or the other, so long as I can get that little old gal with that little something down there between her legs, boy. And so long as we can eat, son, you hear me? I'm hungry, I'm starving, let's eat right now. And off we'd rush to eat. Whereof, as saith Ecclesiastes, it is your portion under the sun. A Western kinsman of the sun, Dean. Although my aunt warned me that he would get me in trouble, I could hear a new call and see a new horizon, and believe it at my young age. A little bit of trouble, or even Dean's eventual rejection of me as a buddy, putting me down, as he would later, on starving sidewalks and sickbeds. What did it matter? I was a young writer, and I wanted to take off. Somewhere along the line, I knew there'd be girls, visions, everything. Somewhere along the line, the pearl would be handed to me.